Will Goldstein here, thekingscourt.com. Again, there's a chance to subscribe down there by hitting the button. It's free. It'll help other people to come. I'm also a musician, as many of you have heard before, so you can always check out my music. Releasing a new songbook very soon, in the next week or two. I thought I was going to finish it by the end of last year, but I didn't quite make it. But anyway, it's coming up soon. It's Proverbs book 2. It's another 91 songs. I don't know what number of songbook, 28, 29. I think it's 29, I think, is this songbook. Going to try and resume pretty soon on the album that I hoped was going to be done last year, but I've got people that I depend on to make that happen. So keep that in your prayers. I'm doing by C.S. Lewis, Screwtape letters, and this is 27. He doesn't entitle them, and so I'm giving it the title Prayer, Free Will, and Predestination. Also included in this, C.S. Lewis mentions in this chapter Boethius. Doesn't say much about it, just a brief comment. I am going to insert into this some of the important things that Boethius is known for. Lots of things, but one of the things is he's a medieval philosopher, and he has a lot to say. Some of it is free will, eternity, time, things like that. He was far ahead of his time. Boethius, a very fascinating figure with very revolutionary ideas. He was also a Christian. Wormwood, the patient's love distracts his mind from the enemy, but distraction and the wandering mind are now one of his chief subjects of his prayers. So you have largely failed. He accepts distraction as his present problem and lays that before the enemy in his prayers. So you have done harm. Anything which moves him close to the enemy works against us in the long run. Screwtape is badgering the demon Wormwood because he failed, because the young man is praying and addressing the problem that he has a wandering mind, which a lot of people often have a wandering mind. They're trying to pray. They find themselves thinking about something completely different. It would have been better for the demons if the young man would have never noticed this and would not have been concerned about it. Now that he is in love, a new idea of happiness has arisen in his mind, a new urgency in his prayers. It is time to raise intellectual difficulties about prayer. False spirituality is always to be encouraged. Remember, these are demons here. Praise and communion with God is true prayer, but humans can often be lured into direct obedience to the enemy, which again is God to them, who has told them to pray for their daily bread and the recovery of the sick. Your patient is in the habit of obedience. He will continue praying whatever you do. Worry him about the haunting suspicion that the practice of his prayers has no objective benefit. If the thing he prays for doesn't happen, it is more proof that prayers don't work. Make him think it would have happened anyway, and thus a granted prayer becomes just as good a proof as a denied one that prayers are ineffective. Obviously, the demon is just trying to get him to think that he's just talking to himself, that God really doesn't hear prayers, that he doesn't answer them. If he does pray and it doesn't happen, then cause him to think that God is not listening and answering his prayers. And if it does happen, then cause him to think that it would have happened anyway. It was bound to happen. So his prayers were futile. In other words, just stop praying altogether. You're just wasting your time. It's the whole idea that the demons are trying to convey to him, to get him to stop praying. Of course, God does truly answer prayer. He doesn't always answer prayer the way that we want him to answer it, but he does answer prayer one way or another. If you explain to him that men's prayers are coordinates with which the enemy, which is God in this sense, harmonizes our life, he would reply, the enemy knew those prayers, and if so, they did not pray freely, but we're predestined. He's getting into the idea of predestination. Predestination exists. We're getting into Boethius now. God is outside time, and because of that, he sees what happens in all aspects of time in his eternal now, let's just say. If that's the case and God sees what is going to happen, then he's saying the prayers are futile because God already knows and sees what's going to happen. There's different views on this. There are examples in Scripture where God does change his mind. Moses prayed to God, who was about to kill all the Israelites, and God changed his mind. In a certain sense, God is changeless. And so he sees what is currently happening, and he sees that outside of time because he exists outside of time. He created time, and before time existed, when there was no time, he existed. So therefore, he sees all things in the eternal now. If God sees things in the eternal now, that he sees what's going to happen in the future, then the demon is arguing that, again, your prayers are futile. Determinism, in other words. The problem of adapting the spiritual universe to the corporal universe is that creation operates at every point of space and time as a series of successive events. Free will is the problem of problems. The enemy does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in a future. He sees them doing so in his unbounded now. To watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. That's probably the most important statement in this reading. To watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. The whole philosophical argument of free will and how it coexists with predestination is based on that. God does see what happens, but he sees it in his eternal now because he's not in a sequence of time events. He sees it, but he only sees it because the person makes that decision. So he's not forcing them to make that decision. They are simply making that decision. And as they make that decision, whenever they are in a sequence of time, God in his eternal now outside of that time sees that that decision is made. But he doesn't see that until they make the decision. So they do actually have free will. And then as that free will acts, then God sees immediately that this is part of history. It may be replied, some writers, notably Boethius, have let this secret out. I'm going to get to Boethius soon. You needn't bother about that. Only the learned read old books, and the learned now are the least likely to acquire wisdom. So he's commenting on basically the historical Jesus movement. They're so caught up in all the things that are irrelevant. They call themselves learned, but they reject everything in the past because they want all the glory. The historical point of view means that a learned man is presented with any statement of an ancient author. The one question he never asks is whether it is true. I'll say that again. The one question this so-called learned man never asks is whether it is actually true. He asks, who influenced the ancient writer? How consistent is it in other books? What phase in the writer's development or thought illustrate how it affected later writers? How has it been misunderstood by learned men? What is the general course of criticism for the last 10 years? What is the present state of the question? To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge to modify your thoughts or your behavior or opinions would be rejected as simple-minded. In other words, the ancients have nothing of value to say. everything is diverted. We don't care about what he actually said or what it's really true. We just care about all the other irrelevant questions that I just read to you. Ridiculous. To deceive humans, it is most important to cut every generation off from the others. There you have it. So Boethius and people like Aristotle, Plato, the list is endless of ancient philosophers. Marcus Aurelius, to cut them all off as though they don't have anything relevant to say. And so that the current thinking becomes the mindset for the future, as though they're going to take all the glory for what their current minds are thinking and their opinions. Of course, they're going to die and become part of history. It's utter stupidity, if you want my opinion. Free commerce between the ages is always a danger, for the errors of one may be corrected by the truths of another. I'll say that again. For the errors of one may be corrected by the truths of another. They don't want truth. They want endless, perpetual error. Separate the ages so that you only have a current generation thinking in their own minds that are now being twisted by the current philosophy, so they can't look back at the ancients and gain any wisdom from them because they're deemed irrelevant. Thanks to the historical point of view, scholars are now little nourished by the past. Leading into Boethius, I have a short little paper here that I put up about Boethius. So here's a step back into the past that C.S. Lewis made some small comments about. Anicius Manlius Theravinus Boethius, commonly known simply as Boethius, was a Roman senator, consul, historian, and philosopher of the early Middle Ages. He was also a Christian. Boethius explains that humans still have free will because they are rational beings and their minds are not controlled by the laws of inanimate nature. God, being eternal, sees all time as present, and so divine foreknowledge does not impose or indicate any necessity that would conflict with free will. He's outside of time. Boethius concludes by expressing even free will choices fall under the absolute sovereignty of God. God is existing outside of time, watching it, and he is directing the course of history, but he is watching the free will that exists within that history. Nevertheless, God knows the temporal order in accordance with his nature. Boethius argues it is because God is timelessly eternal that he is able to know that entire order immediately, in the sense that he knows it non-sequentially. God does not exist in time. He exists outside of time. He created time. So he doesn't see things sequentially, which is impossible for a human mind to comprehend. He just simply sees all of the past, present, and future all before him in his eternal now. He just sees it as something that's happening. The wheel of fortune is a similar concept to logos, and Boethius' attitude towards his execution showed his stoicism as well. He was executed, convicted of treason on false charges, and you don't want to know how he died. Thomas Aquinas and many other Western Christian philosophers carried on the Stoic ideas from Boethius. So he had a huge impact on, just like it says, people like Thomas Aquinas. I feel as though I adapt a lot of Stoic philosophy. I tend to think that it's very helpful. There's nothing inside of Stoicism that conflicts with Christianity. Stoicism is the acceptance of the reality of what's happening and making the best out of it, in very simplistic terms. Boethius argues that what an omniscient God foresees in the future must happen because he sees it. He exists outside of it, but he does see it happen. Whether it happens because he sees it or he sees it because it will happen is irrelevant. God may not directly cause our actions, but because we do them, he sees them. And so because he sees them because we do them, then of course it's sort of futile to say it's necessary. He just simply sees that you do it. Fate, on the other hand, is the time-bound sequential unfolding of providence. Fate controls human and natural actions because it represents a causal chain which is itself unchangeable. God's wisdom directs all things together for his ultimately good purposes. God foresees the entire path of history. He knows the end from the beginning. Because of that, it's unchangeable, but it's only in the sense that he knows the decisions that we're going to make as we make them. But again, he exists outside of time, so it's impossible to really fully comprehend. But this is the thinking. Boethius thought of eternity as God's mode of existence and defined God's eternality as the complete possession all at once of illimitable life. So again, he is the only one in possession of this, where he sees all of history as a glance before him present. It's the eternal now, so it's all present to him in his eternal now. Similarly, Boethius holds that God is goodness itself, and that the order of the universe imposed by God is necessarily good as well. However, though Boethius was a Christian, The Consolation of Philosophy, an excellent book, highly recommend that book, is not explicitly Christian in its conception of the divine. It's not a book about who Jesus is. It's about his philosophy and his mind and his insights into who he thinks God is. So it doesn't contradict anything in Christian theology. It's just not about Christianity. It's about his view of philosophy in total alignment, as far as I can remember, with Christian philosophy. Like I said, it doesn't have anything to say about Christ. It just has some things to say about eternity, free will, predestination, those sorts of things. Great book, The Consolation of Philosophy. Here's a quote from Boethius: "Among wise men there is no place at all left for hatred. For no one except the greatest of fools would hate good men, and there is no reason at all for hating the bad. For just as weakness is a disease of the body, so wickedness is a disease of the mind." God made everything good. Wickedness is a disease of the mind. For Boethius, God's eternality means more than he is infinitely old and never going to die. It means that he is Lord over time and thus equally in all time. He is equally in all time. Therefore, divine foreknowledge is not really foreknowledge at all. He just simply is in everything. You can't hide from God. The endless list of all the places you could try to hide from God, but you cannot hide from God. He is in all places in all time. He is everywhere in every time. Lady Philosophy explains to Boethius that any human action presupposes two things: will and ability. She then goes on to say that the whole effort of man's will, which is vital in his activities, is in the direction of happiness, with happiness being the good itself. Humanity, no matter who you are, good or bad even, you're always seeking happiness. Your happiness is in alignment with those two things, the will and the ability. In order to produce happiness, you make decisions, which is based on your will, and you have the ability to make those decisions, and you're always in pursuit of happiness. In Boethius, the contrast is between timeless eternity, which only God enjoys, and everlastingness, which, well, according to people like Plato, the world itself possesses. It is the common judgment, then, of all creatures that live by reason that God is eternal. Eternity is not the same as everlasting. Only God is eternal because God existed before time existed. There was never a time when he didn't exist. Everlasting implies that there was a beginning and that it is marching through until the end. Even if it goes on into eternity, it still had a beginning. This world had a beginning. Aristotle thought that nature had no beginning. Scripture said the universe was spoke into existence by God. So he literally breathed it into existence. And also it says that there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So there apparently will be some sort of end to our current existence. So a new heaven and a new earth means this earth at some point going to terminate. So it does have an end, though eternity marches on, because when this world has an end, there will be a new world. That's part of the eternity, and part of being born again in Christ is then you have the right to exist in that perpetual eternity through immortal being that we will eventually be risen to. God is without beginning or end, and he has no temporal succession. That is, he does not move through time as we do. The eternality of God is simply the infinitude of God applied to time. Again, God does not move through time. It's his infinitude is applied to time, but he is without beginning or end, and he has no succession. He's not moving through time. He just simply is aware at his eternal glance, his now glance. He is aware of all of history. Pretty inconceivable to think of the mind of God. At the end of the day, we have choices to make, and hopefully the choices we make with our free will put us into a better future and give us hope for tomorrow.